You've heard of the Great Reset, the idea that a small group of global elites are attempting to reshape how the world runs. Essentially, the suspicion is these select elites are trying to gain control of everything, from energy to food to money and other resources. And in order to control these things, they need to monitor everyone and everything. They need to own everything that everyone then has to rent or buy from them. And they have to have some sort of policing mechanism, a weapon of some kind. Could be an actual weapon like threatening war or some other type of punishment like sanctions, or for the average person, the development of the social credit system. Now, all of this sounds like a conspiracy theory. Sounds like something out of a dystopian novel and clearly something rooted in paranoia. But is it? Mark Morano is the author of The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown, which was released today. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kim. Happy to be here today.
So, the first question I think a lot of people have, they hear about the Great Reset, they think this sounds like a conspiracy theory. Uh, who would be doing this and why?
Well, that's a great question. If you need to look at who would be doing it and why, just look at COVID. COVID is what activated the Great Reset. It was always a sort of a dream, and COVID made it a reality. So the people who would want this to be a reality would be, first of all, ideologues, people pushing the idea of expertocracy, for lack of a better word, the idea that we need our lives ruled by credentialed experts, that left to our own devices, we, the unwashed masses, would essentially create racism, inequity, environmental destruction, a climate crisis, a public health disaster. So we need the guidance of the best and brightest of society. And it goes back 100 years in the United States to at least Woodrow Wilson's administration that came up with this concept and really started pushing it. The idea of ruled by experts. The average person wouldn't have to trouble themselves with all these decisions. They'll just be told and regulated about what they should do. So the ideology benefits, and then who benefits in implementing this sort of philosophy? That's going to be non-government organizations. It's going to be international groups, from the World Health Organization to the World Economic Forum to the United Nations. Big organizations like the EU, the African Union, they get to have all their bureaucrats. They get to start regulating. In the case of California, without vote of anyone in California, Gavin Newsom declared a executive order, and then an unelected bureaucratic cardboard announced that they were going to stop the sale of gas-powered engines. That's an example of how the Great Reset would work. In other words, people can't decide. It can't be left to you to buy your own car, because the planet can't handle the emissions from it. So we've decided for you to take that option off the table. And so you have finance companies. In the case of the car, by the way, Kim, they are having Australian banks aren't going to finance gas-powered cars. The World Bank has announced they're not going to fund it, all due to climate concerns. They're not going to allow funding for climate for gas-powered cars, which means the automakers won't even get that choice. They won't be able to get the financing to do it. So it's sort of, if you will, a close-knit group of people. And I think at the center is the World Economic Forum in Davos, run by Klaus Schwab. They have this big meeting, which is essentially a way to do off-the-books lobbying. So you get the Fortune 500 and a lot more. You get the media, you get academia, you get Hollywood, you get celebrities, you get all of corporate business going together for these conferences. And the average person can't get in. Even as media, you got to pay like $35,000 and be approved. But here's where they come up with all of these plans, and then you see them in action. You see it happen with the Netherlands farmers not being able to grow their crops, putting out almost 12,000 family-run small farms based on modern agricultural concerns that were somehow overheating the planet. These are all emanating from a net zero climate agenda coming from the World Economic Forum. So the people who benefit are the corporate finance, corporations, government leaders, the media, who literally pay to go to these events and echo them and keep them happy and do fawning coverage. And even academia, with these professors and others who are on a gravy train of funding and doing the necessary science to support the goals. And we saw a lot of that with COVID, particularly COVID modeling studies. It's always like, our model shows disaster unless we do the following political things.
So it sounds to me like you're saying that this is more of a groupthink issue rather than maybe one person. I mean, you've mentioned Klaus
Yes, this is
Schwab.
not, it's not one evil Bond villain about to take over the world. No, it's a philosophy that's been around for a long time. And I think it ebbs and flows. But one of the biggest things, and I go back to the Roman Republic through the Middle Ages, through 1930s Germany, and show the abuse of emergency powers. So this is just, it's as old as the ability of any government leader or bureaucrat to gain power. This appeals to them, the Great Reset.
Yeah.
And emergency powers, crisis, a climate crisis, a viral crisis, COVID crisis, a secure 9/11 terrorism crisis. This is where the biggest abuses of government power happen. And I lay that out in the book. And COVID is the latest. And of course, now Joe Biden is set to declare, according to the Associated Press, a national climate emergency, which will give him 130 executive powers, also extending to governors and mayors, where they could do all sorts of energy restrictions and lifestyle and interference similar to COVID.
So, and I think that's an important point for people to understand is that this isn't like one, kind of guy behind the curtain that is
Yeah, no,
pulling
not
all
at
the
all.
levers and trying to gain control of everything. That this is more of this sort of collective groupthink that's kind of blossomed and been fed and then has just continued on. And anybody who seems to talk out against it, anybody in that crowd that maybe shows up to Davos, I would imagine if somebody says, I don't know about I don't really agree with this or that, maybe they don't get invited back the next year. They get shunned. It's sort of like being a part of the popular crowd in high school. If you don't go along with what they want you to go along with, then you suddenly are cut out and you are now a pariah and people no longer want to talk to you, do business with you, associate with you, take photographs with you, go to your parties. You're not invited to the parties, right? So, and so it kind of perpetuates this group think attitude. And so, is there anybody really, even though it's not necessarily one person behind the curtain, do you think there is one or a group of people that are more in charge of this, that have schemed this out?
Well, yes. I think the World Economic Forum, led by Klaus Schwab, they have been at this for years. Their 2016 video, "You will own nothing, you'll be happy.
Yeah.
You will have everything delivered by drone. You'll have no privacy. Life will never be better. Meat will be a rare and expensive treat. The United States will no longer be the world superpower." They've laid out a vision they're sort of the mediator or the people where everyone comes together and they have these annual Davos meetings. But what I think happened was, and they were moving along with this, and it could be ignored. I didn't pay attention to it. I never actually paid much attention to the Great Reset concept until June of 2020, when they announced that we needed a Great Reset. COVID gave us that rare, narrow window of opportunity. But yeah, they would be the ones. The other ones behind this would definitely be China, the influence of China, and the World Health Organization. The head of it is Tedros. World Health Organization, besides the United States government, the number one funder is Bill Gates. Bill Gates funded scientists, and Tedros at the World Health Organization did a sham investigation in January of 2020 into how China was handling COVID. They went to China, did a fact-finding mission, came back and said, if you want to know how to handle COVID, do what China's doing, which was draconian, authoritarian, tyrannical lockdowns.
Extreme, yeah.
And that is really how this all started. And the idea was we were no longer in charge of our own lives. We had a crisis which required emergency government action, and we were supposed to be quiet and told what to do.
But certainly they've been the ideas of controlling the population, because otherwise the population will just run amok on their own. Yeah. Which is you're right. Very much in China, they do have a lot more control over the population. They have a much larger population, and they have much stricter rules in how the population must behave than compared to a place like the United States. So I could see where, as populations grow, leaders get more concerned and they think, well, these people could really overrun us. So but clearly this has been going on prior to COVID. So when do you think this sort of idea of you will own nothing, you're going to rent from us, when do you think this really truly started?
Well, that's a good question. You could say it started, first of all, it started with Malthus, probably, the philosopher who believed in essentially that the earth was limited resource and scarcity. And the idea is the population had to be controlled because the earth, we weren't able to support the resources. This was later, picked up, and it goes all the way. You could talk about Marx, Engels. In the book, you even have the Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Lenin. The idea of chaos creates he says the worse the better, worse is better. according to the archive I could find, the historical footnotes. And the idea is the worse you can collapse a society, then you can impose your visionary, radical notion on them, or you can cause revolutionary change. But if you go forward, you had the Club of Rome in the 1970s. There's always been a strain of humanity who believes we're doomed and that the end is near, essentially. And that's what we're talking. COVID was the end is near. Climate is the end is near. 9/11, terrorism. We're all, we have to give up our rights because we're all going to die by terrorists. It's that fear that they use, and it's as old as government itself, the idea of more power, more control. But I would say in our country, or in Western politics, certainly since the late 60s, early 70s, Paul Ehrlich's overpopulation philosophy really brought it into the mainstream. And there was actually a point where, and you can look this up in the old archives, Paul Ehrlich was proposing sterilization agents added to drinking water or water in Africa, in the United States, in order to keep population down. There were some really scary proposals by these mainstream figures. I mean, Paul Ehrlich was on Johnny Carson once a month in his heyday in the 1970s, and he was always predicting the end of oil, always predicting famines, and he was spectacularly wrong on everything, but it doesn't matter. His heart, according to the ideology, was in the right place. And then moving forward, I really think 9/11 in the United States was a big sea change. I mean, I was sort of a Pat Buchanan, Walter Williams student. So I was a free market, and I also was against the Iraq War. I was against the Gulf War. I was against the occupation of Afghanistan. And I was horrified at what I saw with the Patriot Act, with the creation of that whole surveillance state under George Bush, Dick Cheney. I've now revised my entire opinion of the Bush. I've gone through a personal evolution. I mean, I never thought much. I thought NAFTA was fine. I thought world trade. I was against Occupy Wall Street. But looking back, and I covered all these as a journalist, there was a lot of good messages there. I think Ross Perot was right about NAFTA and all these trade agreements, which essentially farmed everything out to China and harmed America. And beyond that, and this is what's driving this whole idea. The idea is the World Economic Forum is saying that automation is going to happen. They're talking about a fourth industrial revolution, which is creepy. They talk about like a fusion of human and machine. But essentially, there's going to be a lot of, quote, useless eaters, according to some of the World Economic. And they actually advise psychedelic drugs and video games to occupy us, because we're not going to have much to do. That's why, you'll own nothing. Everything you want will be delivered by drones. We'll be playing video games, and we'll be taking happy pills. That's sort of their vision. It's a dystopian vision.
I'm glad you brought up 9/11, because I know that you often, I know you come from the Republican side of the aisle,
Yeah.
and you often blame a lot of these policies on leftists. But I mean, really, it's not just the left that is doing this
No.
type of stuff. It's coming from both sides.
Yes. In fact, I've tried to actually avoid going after, and the left. I would say progressivism. It depends on that old argument. Was Hitler right wing or left wing? So you can get into that argument.
Right.
I think, yeah. So I'm not even going to go there. The idea, but whether it's a circle in the continuum. But the point is, and I devote a whole chapter to this, Kim, where I have Russell Brand, Jimmy Dore, Naomi Wolf, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Bill Maher even, and I have open arms for them. I say this is no longer a left and right political cause. This is between tyranny and freedom, and we need to welcome these people. I've had many conversations with Naomi Wolf. I want to reach out to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but it's interesting. I interviewed Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in 2014, and he actually wanted all climate deniers at The Hague as war criminals with 3 square meals and a cot. This was his attitude. I don't know if he still believes that, because if you look at what they want to do with climate through the United Nations, through the World Health Organization, the same through the World Economic Forum, you notice that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has gone silent on a lot of this stuff, Green New Deal, because I think he has to realize that the same template they use for COVID, they want to use for
Right.
climate. And I think in the book, I actually state all is forgiven to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., even despite the fact he wanted me and my friends thrown in The Hague with 3 square meals and a cot. I'm willing to forgive it all because he's been so eloquent against the lockdowns, against the vax mandates.
It's interesting because I think so many of us have gone through evolutions, as you mentioned, yourself
Yeah.
going through this personal evolution. I think many of us, as we face, and this is just life, and I'm sure we'll go through many more evolutions throughout the
Yeah.
rest of our lives, right? The more we see, the more we learn, the more we change, and we say, wait a minute, maybe I was wrong previously, and now this is, and now I'm seeing things from a different perspective. And I think it's interesting you bring him up because obviously he's been painted during COVID as an anti-vax, science
Yeah.
denier, and you being a very much a critic of climate policies and a lot of the climate narrative. And we're not getting into that today, but I know
Yeah.
that's been something you've been very much critical of. And then you've been painted as, climate science denier. And so I think anybody
Same
now
thing.
who's been labeled a denier of some kind kind of has sympathy for others who have been labeled
Yeah.
deniers and maybe takes a step back and say, maybe I was a bit wrong and hasty. I would like to learn a little bit more about what that person was saying before I jump to a judgment.
And I point out in this book, the new definition for a vax denier or anti-vaxxer
Right.
is someone who opposes mandates, which
Yeah.
is, I don't think that's historically been the definition, but now they can
No.
credibly say you're an anti-vaxxer unless you support all of these mandates.
Yeah, that is the changing definitions. And again, it does make people stop and step back and say, wait a minute, if you've been labeled and smeared something, that might not be accurate. I need to hear you out because their
Yeah.
idea of that label could be something just completely bogus, like saying I'm not for mandating vaccination. Suddenly now you're an anti-vaxxer. You know,
And we're also finding they're changing the definition of lockdown and who was for it. If you see Trump's Surgeon General Jerome Adams, who now is involved in all this equity stuff, he's sort of cashing in, but he actually says we never were locked down in the United States. It never happened. And then you have the CDC director Walensky now on TV this week saying, I was never part of those those were before I came here. I had nothing to do with lockdowns, as if during her time at Biden they had nothing that resembled a lockdown. It's kind of what they did when people said socialism failed or Marxism failed. They always say, well, it wasn't done correctly. The old Soviet Union, that didn't count. We're going to do it right. We're going to do it the right way next time. And that's what I've seen repeatedly on these lockdowns. They're trying to change the definition to, even though churches, gyms, schools, weddings, funerals, stay-at-home orders, curfews, mask mandates, vax mandates, and every business closed except big corporate chains like Walmart and big tech thriving and the biggest transfer of wealth, they'll credibly say we were never actually really locked down. That's what then they're redefining it in real time as we speak.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Interesting, Mark. What your book sounds interesting. So this came out today: The Great Reset, Global Elites, and the Permanent Lockdown. Where can people get it?
You can get it on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. And I have 2 chapters on climate, but not what you'd think. They're not about climate change or science. It's about how 230 medical journals, including the Harvard School of Medicine, including scientific journals like Nature, all want to use the template of COVID
Yeah.
lockdowns in order to approach climate. And
Well,
there's actually a Gates Soros-funded professor in Europe who openly says, we're going to need climate lockdowns. They're coining the phrase. And there's
yeah.
energy lockdowns. So
Well,
it's
and
an
I
amazing
think
thing.
I think we're starting to see that. I mean, I think what you're bringing up a really great point. I think with, for example, the Netherlands and Sri Lanka and other areas of the world, we are seeing these policies being used in the name of we've got to save the planet because of the climate disaster. And I think that has caused many of us who have been very much like just I'm not a scientist, so I automatically, and this is how I was even before COVID when it came to, let's say, vaccines or any other
Yeah.
medication. Except obviously I had a definite major skepticism of big pharma, so I always knew that was there. But as far as the institutions, the research institutions, I didn't ever really question the research institutions. Now looking back, I think, gosh, you dummy. I mean, of course they're funded by find out who, follow the money, right? There is all
Yeah.
of that. But I always just believed the research institutions. And I think many of us just automatically believe the scientists. They all seem to collectively say something is going on. So we just say, well, then that must be what it is. If overwhelmingly all the scientists say this, then it must be. And I think COVID definitely did open up the eyes for many people where they
Yes.
say, wait a minute, maybe it isn't, even if they're all collectively in unison saying the same thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that that is the thing that's actually happening. And then for them to use those policies, as we've seen implemented in the Netherlands and in particularly Sri Lanka, which caused absolute disaster, it's no doubt worse that they cannot feed their population than
Yeah.
anything else they could have dealt with when it comes to climate disasters. And
And
so we're seeing that, and I think that is definitely causing a lot of people to question a lot more.
they are. Again, California, they're creating car shortages with the net zero food production thing. They're creating food shortages. They've already created massive energy shortages. These are all man-made. And it's because of this age, almost an age of superstition, where they believe if we appease the gods with all of these policies and suffer that somehow we'll get better weather at the other end of the rainbow. It's frightening stuff.
Well, and you know, we always think that they've thought this through, right? Well,
Yeah,
before they ban this, of course, they've thought this through and they have a plan for how we're going to, you know, for example, in Europe, I was just reading that in Germany, they've banned now combustion engines, right? They're no
yes,
longer going to sell them after a certain date. And my thought was, well, certainly they've thought this through, right? I mean, they've
yeah.
thought about the electrical grid and how they're going to charge all of these new electric cars that are going to be hitting the market. Certainly they've thought about that. But then you look at you look at places like Sri Lanka, you look at the Netherlands, you look at all these other places and these other policies, and you think they have not thought these things through. They implement these things and then they say, we'll see what comes. You know, whatever it
Yeah.
is, we'll deal with it when it happens. And now with like these COVID lockdowns, we're seeing the ramifications of that, and that's grave, especially for young people. So they haven't thought these things through, and that's what's extra scary about all of it.
No, they haven't. In fact, most of the stuff they're doing is sort of this sounds good. This is what we have to do. We have to save the planet. And they just think if we achieve it, we pat ourselves on the back and everyone's happy. But they're not realizing what happens next. And
Next,
we're seeing
right?
what happens next. And
Yeah.
the food thing is going to Canada, it's going to Australia, spreading throughout Europe. Bill Gates, and I cite in my book, is, according to NBC News, America's largest single farmland owner. But I like to say, don't worry, if those of you worried about a monopoly, China is also gobbling up U.S.
Yeah.
farmland. So this is this is all part of that real issue. We're not going to own our own food production. We're not going to have control of our energy production. As you mentioned, EV means more reliance on China for rare earth mining, more reliance on South America for lithium and other substances. So there's no way they can ramp up these cars. So if you want to see the future of California, Germany, you can pretty much look at Cuba. They banned car. People can't get new cars there, so they're driving around a lot of vintage cars. So maybe
Yeah.
that's how we should look at it. You know, there are a lot of used cars. Or if there's a waiting list for these electric cars when they try to ramp them up, it's going to be like East Germany trying to buy the old Trabant. Remember, people had to be in the waiting list for that crappy little East German car. This is the fallacy of central planners. They think they can think of every aspect of human endeavor. They're smarter. They got credentials. They're experts. It comes to masking your kids. You can't decide for yourself whether your kindergartner should be masked. We are going to let a 30-year public health expert with a PhD in epidemiology. They're the ones that know. You're a college dropout. You have no say in that. How would you possibly know what's best for your kid? We're the experts. Shut
Yeah.
up, peasant. That's the mindset. That's the Great Reset. You will own nothing. You will have no say, and censorship a huge part of it. And this is where we are. So I try to end hopefully too with the book. The book ends in a positive chapter, and it's about the Great Resist, and it begins at the public school, at the school board level. And I talk about how that is really where the pushback came. Grew from Loudoun County to a new election, which then the Democrats were forced to do a focus group. New York Times reported the focus group results found after election losses that the Democrat base wanted to return to normal. Within days of that focus group, every major city dropped vax and mask mandates. And they said the science has changed. Well, yeah, the political science changed.
Hmm.
And that was a big thing. So it's just resistance at the localist level. That's what people need to do. What the
Interesting.
farmers in Netherlands are doing. That's the way to
Right.
fight this right now.
Sounds like the mama bears, right? Don't mess with mama bear.
Yes. And what you did, walking away, you know, from I saw your interview with Russell Brand, walking
Yeah.
away from the Hill after what they pulled with Anthony Fauci. I mean, you cannot tolerate that because it just emboldens them. You know, let
Yeah.
them become more marginalized, let them lose you. And this is what people need to start doing. I wish more people had stood up on the vax mandates in their employers and everything else.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Mark Moreno, he is the author of The Great Reset,
Thank
Global
you.
Elites, and the Permanent Lockdown. You can get that. It came out today, so check it out.
Thank you, Kim. Appreciate it.